I have watched armies collapse, not from enemy fire, not from hunger or cold or the long, slow rot of a losing war. I have watched armies collapse because the soldiers inside them finally understood, at some bone-deep molecular level, that the thing standing across the field from them was not going to stop. That is a different kind of fear, not the sharp animal fear of danger, the hollow, cathedral fear of something that simply will not end. I am Kale Vor, third-rank observer of the Thraxian High Command, veteran of 11 interstellar engagements, undefeated in single combat since the age of 18 cycles. I have been afraid exactly 4 times in my life. Each time, the fear was brief and manageable, and I walked away from whatever caused it. Each time, I filed a clean report and moved on to the next assignment with the professional detachment that 20 years of observation training is designed to produce. I am telling you this so you understand what it means when I say that I stood in a stadium on the human world called Earth and felt something in my chest go quiet and cold and wrong. It was not brief. I did not walk away from it. I am still not entirely sure I have. The invitation came 6 weeks before the formal ceremony. A transmission from the human diplomatic office, phrased with the particular warmth that humans pour into everything like a condiment, stating that before the Thraxian military observer delegation arrived for the standard assessment proceedings, the human delegation would very much love to host us at what their liaison called a cultural celebration, a morale event. They hoped we would come a few days early. They had something they wanted us to see. I read it twice. The language was friendly, relaxed, the kind of communication you send to someone you are not nervous about, which is either confidence or ignorance, and I could not tell from the text alone which one it was. I forwarded it to High Command with a note that said I saw no strategic reason to decline and several diplomatic reasons to accept, and they agreed without much thought, because nobody on the High Command was particularly worried about humans at that time. This was, as I have said in every subsequent briefing, their first significant error of judgment in 32 years of otherwise competent strategic planning. I understood the lack of concern. I shared it initially. The human species had been observed from a distance for decades. They occupied a single solar system, had spread to a handful of nearby stations and 2 marginally terraformed rocks, and their technology, while not primitive, was not remarkable by the standards of the broader galactic catalog. They were small, individually fragile. Their lifespan, while not the shortest in the catalog, was not long by any comparison that mattered. They had no hive mind, no collective biological communication, no shared consciousness that would allow coordinated response at the level of instinct. They had to talk to each other, with their mouths, and then wait for the other being to respond. They were, by every conventional metric the Compact used to assess new members, a mid-tier species applying for entry into an organization that contained several species capable of casually dismantling everything the humans had built in an afternoon. And yet, the files. The files that I had read, that most people had read and noted and then filed away in the category of historical information rather than active intelligence, because the events they described were old enough to feel like settled history rather than active data points. The Vorkai situation, which the official Compact record described with language so carefully chosen that you had to read it several times before you understood what the language was not saying. The Kethanari border incursion of 2198 that the human response team had resolved in 11 hours, leaving behind a situation so thoroughly handled that the Kethanari internal reports, which I had read through channels I will not specify here, described it using a word in their language that translates roughly as definitively addressed in a manner that does not invite reconsideration. 3 separate occasions across 40 years of pre-compact observation where human vessels, facing situations that should have ended in either retreat or acceptable loss, had done something else entirely. Each time the outcome was the same. The humans were still there at the end. Whatever had been on the other side of them was not. I thought about the files on the transport to the human world. I thought about them the way you think about a series of data points that individually mean nothing and collectively mean something you have not named yet, and you are turning the data in your hands, rotating it, looking for the shape underneath the numbers. The shape kept presenting one angle, and then another, and none of the angles fit cleanly into any model I had been trained to use. And I kept telling myself this was because the dataset was incomplete, which is what a trained observer tells themselves when the dataset is complete and the model is the problem. Claire met us at the landing platform. She was the human liaison assigned to our delegation, and she was small in the way that all humans are small, which is to say, in a way that I had been trained by 20 years of observation to find unremarkable, and which I was already, at first glance, beginning to revise. Not because of any one thing, because of the specific combination of things. The eyes that processed our arrival with genuine curiosity, rather than the rehearsed diplomatic version. The kind of curiosity that looks at you and actually wants to know what it finds, rather than performing the gesture of wanting to know. The handshake that treated my chitin hand like a completely ordinary thing to shake, without the fractional pause that every other species manages when they touch Thraxian exoskeleton for the first time. That small hesitation, where the body's instinct and the brain's professionalism negotiate a settlement. There was no hesitation with Claire. She shook my hand the way she shook the hands of everyone in the delegation, which is to say with the specific brisk warmth of someone who has been meeting new people her whole life, and finds each one interesting rather than challenging. The smile that followed was warm and practiced, and had underneath it something that it took me 2 full days to name. "We are so glad you could come early," she said. "We thought it would be nice to show you something before all the formal proceedings, give you a real sense of who we are." "A cultural celebration," I said, using the phrase from the invitation. "Sure," she said. "You could call it that." She smiled again. I noted the smile. I noted what was behind it, which was not malice, not calculation, not the particular species-wide performance of peace that many compact members have refined over centuries of diplomatic practice. It was something else, something that I could not name in any of my 11 languages, which bothered me more than I showed, because naming things accurately is the foundation of the work I do, and a thing I could not name was a gap in my preparation. "Do you have a stadium?" she asked. "Or any large enclosed space, designed for group gatherings and physical competitions?" I told her the compact maintained a facility originally designed for Grethian ceremonial games, capacity 400,000, equipment neutral, with a field surface that could be reconfigured for various competitive formats. "Perfect," she said. That word, that single flat word, delivered with the same weight and warmth as everything else she said, no more emphasis than the rest of the sentence, and yet something in the way she landed on it made my internal alert systems produce a signal I overrode on professional grounds. I should not have overridden it. The transport from the landing platform to the compact facility took 40 minutes, and Claire spent those 40 minutes telling me about the event they had planned, with the specific good-natured enthusiasm of someone describing something they genuinely love to someone who has not experienced it yet. She talked about the athletes who would be participating, about the history of the competitions we would see, about the years of preparation that went into this kind of performance. She used words like dedication and commitment and training, with the casual frequency of someone describing the weather, as though these were ordinary features of how a species prepares itself for ordinary activities, the way you mention that water is wet when explaining swimming. I listened. I catalogued. I noted the specific vocabulary she used around concepts of physical effort and physical pain, which was the vocabulary of someone for whom these things are simply part of the background of daily existence, the way someone who lives near water uses words for tides and currents with a casual precision that inland people have to consciously acquire. "How long do your athletes train?" I asked. "Depends on the discipline," she said. "The serious competitors, from the time they are children, 8, 10, 12 years at minimum, before reaching the elite level." She considered it. "Though most will tell you they never really stop learning, the preparation just becomes more specific as the years accumulate. 8 to 12 years of dedicated physical conditioning, before reaching elite level." I looked out the window at the human city passing below the transport vehicle, a dense, living thing, full of the specific organized complexity of a species that has been building in the same place for a very long time, and has developed systems for managing what that produces. I thought about the Vorkai. The formal records of my 11 prior engagements include detailed entries on the training regimens of opposing forces. The longest I had encountered, in any species, for a professional military unit, was 6 years. The Thraxian standard was 4 years of intensive preparation, followed by active service deployment. These were the numbers I had been operating with as baseline for my entire career. 8 to 12 years. For the athletes. Not the soldiers. The thought arrived in my mind fully formed, and I put it away, because I had no evidence yet for where it was pointing, and I am a trained observer who does not permit conclusions to form ahead of the data that would support them. I have filed 11 engagement reports and not one of them contains a conclusion that arrived before the evidence. I put the thought away. It came back at the 4-hour mark of the night. There was one other thing in the official briefing materials that I want to mention because it bears directly on what followed. A single line in the pre-integration cultural assessment, buried in the third section of a subsection on human recreation, that I had read and noted and not given its appropriate weight. The line said, "Humans have developed, across the full breadth of their civilization, a cultural tradition of competitive physical activity that predates their recorded history, is present in some form in every documented human society without exception, and appears to serve psychological, social, and identity-forming functions that other species typically assign to different kinds of cultural practice." I had read this and understood it as, humans like games, a footnote, background texture, the kind of information you absorb and do not return to because it does not seem to connect to anything strategically important. What the line was actually saying was, this is a species that has been running, lifting, throwing, wrestling, and hitting each other in structured formats since before they could write about it, across every culture they have ever produced, without a single documented exception. It is not a hobby. It is not a leisure preference. It is structural. It is woven into the species at the level where things go when they have been selected for over a very long period of time, because they serve a function that cannot be served otherwise. The function, I understood later, was this: the regular voluntary experience of pushing the body past where it wants to stop and finding out what is on the other side. A practice. A rehearsal. Conducted weekly, across millions of participants, across the full span of recorded human existence. So that when the unsurvivable zone appeared, or the unrecoverable systems failed, or the exit was open and the alternative was standing in it for 19 hours, the humans who went in or stayed had bodies and nervous systems and decision-making frameworks that had rehearsed this specific experience of going past where stopping seems reasonable. Not soldiers, not emergency workers, the general population, playing games on weekends. I thought about this on the transport. I thought about what it means to rehearse a thing for your entire life without knowing that you are rehearsing it. I thought about the moment when the rehearsal becomes the real situation. I thought about what you bring to the real situation when you have been rehearsing without knowing it. Claire was telling me about the marathon runner who would be competing the next day. He was 41 years old, she said, which in human terms placed him well past what their athletic performance data called peak age, and he had been running competitively for 27 years, and he ran because he found it clarifying, which was the word she used. And I made a note of the word, because clarifying is what you call an experience, that removes unnecessary things and leaves only what matters, and the idea that a 41-year-old human ran 42 kilometers on a scheduled basis in order to remove unnecessary things and encounter only what matters, told me something I was not ready to fully process yet, but filed away for processing later. I processed it at approximately 2 in the morning on the second night. It was more than I had been ready for. I had arrived expecting humans, what I had not prepared for, despite the files, despite the data, despite 20 years of professional observation, was the specific quality of Claire's attention. Most beings in diplomatic contexts attend to you with the part of their awareness that has been designated for the task, the professional surface. Claire attended with everything, which was unsettling in a way I could not immediately quantify, and which my instruments were not designed to measure. She looked at my delegation the way someone looks at a problem they find genuinely interesting, not the problem of how to manage us diplomatically, but the problem of what we were, what we found significant, what we would make of what she was about to show us. It was, I realized later, the same quality I would see in the athletes on the field the next morning. Total investment, no part of the attention held in reserve. "Have you ever watched a competition before?" she asked me during the transport. "Any kind. Anything with rules and opponents, and a thing to win." "I have observed Grethian war game ceremonies," I said, "and Velhari endurance trials." "Did they make you feel anything?" she asked. I considered the question. The Grethian ceremonies were impressive and precisely orchestrated, and left me with a clear sense of what the Grethian military could do, which was the purpose of them. The Velhari trials were austere and ancient, and conveyed something about the Velhari relationship with time and persistence. Both had been professionally useful. They were informative, I said. Claire looked at me with an expression I could not yet read. Today will be different, she said. Not a boast, an accurate forecast. She was right. We arrived at the stadium the following morning. It had been prepared overnight by the human advance team, who had worked through the dark hours in a way that Claire mentioned as a conversational aside, noting that they often performed their best work when a deadline was present. The field had been resurfaced and marked with precise geometric lines in white chalk. Equipment was arranged along the edges in a specific order that I could see had logic to it, without yet being able to read that logic. Metal structures, weighted bars, measuring devices of types I was not immediately familiar with. The chalk smell was pervasive and sharp, and underneath it something else, warm and organic, and faintly alive, which Claire identified as adrenaline, which is what humans call the chemical compound their bodies produce in preparation for a challenge. A chemical that their bodies produce automatically in the presence of a challenge. I am an 11-engagement veteran, and I tell you plainly that I stood in that chalk-smelling stadium and thought, of course they have a chemical for it. Of course they do. Military observer delegations from 6 other species had accepted the invitation to attend. The compact diplomatic offices had framed it as an opportunity for cross-cultural familiarization in advance of the formal integration proceedings, which meant that every species sent their military observers out of professional obligation and polite disinterest. The way you attend a ceremonial function you expect to be brief and mildly interesting at most. The kind of function where you can use the time to review other documents. The Kethanari general arrived in his full formal armor, which is an impressive construction of layered composite material, specifically designed to communicate rank and history through its visual weight. His name was Aresh Tal, 40 years of active command. 6 systems under Kethanari administrative control as a direct result of his strategic decisions across those 4 decades. He greeted me with the abbreviated efficiency of 2 professionals who know each other by reputation and share the same general level of professional disinterest in what is about to happen. I was told this would be under 2 hours, he said. I believe so, I said. We were both wrong. The event began. The human announcer spoke with the energy of someone for whom the existence of this particular morning is the best thing that has happened in recent memory. Claire translated at a half-beat delay beside me, which meant I was receiving her calm, informational version of each announcement alongside the original, and the difference in energy between the two was itself a data point that I noted. The first competition was weightlifting. I settled into my seat. I had read the human physical profile. Their bone density, averaged across the species, was higher than most outside observers expected, given their surface appearance, but still within a range I could classify as known and manageable. Their muscular development, assessed against Thraxian standard comparison models, placed them in a tier I would have described as capable without being remarkable. Their average lifting capacity in clinical trials, measured by the compact pre-integration physical assessment teams over several years of pre-contact observation, had been noted and logged in my briefing materials. I had read those numbers. I had categorized them. I watched the first human approach the bar, and I was prepared to observe something competent and move on to the next item. He lifted 263 kilograms. Clean. One motion. Hips, back, arms, the whole body solving the problem simultaneously, every component contributing at exactly the right moment in the way of something that has been doing this specific thing for long enough that the coordination has become autonomous. He lifted it and held it, and the physics of the moment said he should not have been able to do that, based on the numbers in my briefing materials. And yet there he was, holding it. I looked at my instruments. I looked at the field. I looked at my instruments again. The weight conversion from human units to Thraxian standard confirmed the number. My instruments had not flagged a calibration error. The data was correct, and the data said what it said. The human set the bar down with a sound like a controlled impact event, and stepped back without drama. The next human approached. The bar was heavier. He lifted it too. Aresh Tal was doing the same thing I was doing, which was looking at his instruments, and then looking at the field, and then looking at his instruments, running the comparison against Kethanari strength standards, against the numbers that define the boundaries of what is physically possible within the catalog of known biology, and finding that the comparison was pointing in a direction he had not prepared for this morning. Claire appeared at my shoulder with a small paper cup of something dark. I had not asked for it. She had brought it without being asked, which meant she had expected I would need it, which meant she knew something about what was happening on the field that I had not yet fully processed. I took the cup. The first sip informed me that it was bitter in a way that suggested the bitterness was the purpose and not a flaw in the preparation, and that whatever was in it was specifically designed to keep the brain operational and processing when the brain would otherwise prefer to slow down and take stock from a safe distance. I drank all of it. The weightlifting continued. By the time the final competitor lifted the final weight, the numbers on my instruments had required me to recalibrate my comparison model 3 separate times. Not because the instruments were malfunctioning, but because the comparison model I had arrived with had been built on data that turned out to be insufficient for the situation I was actually observing. That is a precise technical way of saying I had underestimated them, not by a small margin. By a margin that would have been embarrassing to file in a standard engagement report. I want to be specific about what I mean when I say my comparison model required recalibration, because the phrase is precise and technical, and does not fully communicate what it felt like to sit in that stadium and watch the numbers arrive. I have a baseline for every species I have assessed, a range, a set of parameters that define what the species in question can be expected to produce in terms of physical output under various conditions. These baselines are built from decades of observation data, from clinical measurements, from performance records in environments where the species has been documented. They are not guesses. They are the best available picture of what a given type of body can do. My baseline for humans had been built over 4 decades of compact observation, supplemented by clinical data from the pre-integration assessment teams, who had spent years taking measurements and producing reports and feeding those numbers into the catalog. The humans at the competition were not performing within that baseline. They were performing outside it. Not slightly outside it. Not in the range of individual variation that any population produces. Outside it in the way that changes what the baseline was describing, which is to say they were not exceptional members of an accurately described population. They were evidence that the population had been described inaccurately. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing that makes you sit in a stadium and very quietly begin recalculating everything you thought you understood about the species you were here to assess as a professional formality. Areshtal leaned toward me between the second and third competitors. The assessment data, he said, in the encrypted channel. Not a question. I am aware, I said. Who approved the assessment data? 14 separate compact scientific teams over a 30-year period, I said. Multiple peer reviews, consensus findings. A pause. Consensus, he said. Yes. Another pause. Consensus, he said again, in a tone that contained everything he needed to say about what consensus means when the thing being measured declines to stay within the boundaries the consensus established. I looked at the next human approaching the bar. I watched him lift what was on the bar. I updated my model. The second competition was wrestling. 2 humans, no weapons, no armor, no chemical enhancement that my instruments could detect. They were permitted, within the structured rules of the competition, to do whatever their bodies could manage to each other, within a defined space, and under specific constraints. I will not describe each exchange in this account because the account would become very long and lose focus, and also because I am not certain my descriptions would be entirely believed without the instrument readings I filed alongside them. I will describe what mattered, and what mattered was one specific moment. 4 minutes and 17 seconds into the match, one human was driven to the mat by the other, with a force my instruments classified as a significant impact event. The assessment calculated the angle, the combined weight, the velocity of the fall, and the surface beneath the body, and the subroutine that compares impact data against biological tolerance thresholds returned a result I will not quote directly, because the specific classification language would require significant explanatory context. But the summary of it was, this body should be having a conversation with medical personnel right now. The human lay on the mat. He lay there for 2 seconds. He stood up. He was not moving carefully in the way of someone who is managing damage and does not want to telegraph the fact of the management to an opponent. He was moving the way someone moves when their body has just reminded them of its own durability and they find the reminder adequate and intend to make use of it. He was grinning. I have spent 20 years learning to distinguish the performance of emotions from the genuine occurrence of them, because species that compete, negotiate, or fight have developed sophisticated systems for deploying emotional signals strategically, and a field observer who cannot read the difference between a performed emotion and a real one is not much use in the field. I am very good at reading this difference. I have been told so by 5 separate assessment panels over the course of my career. This was not a performed grin. This was a human who had just absorbed something significant and was grinning because he had absorbed it and was still operational, and that outcome satisfied him in some way that the grin expressed, without needing anything else to express it. The Grethian general made a sound. I do not have a translation for the specific sound. The nearest conceptual equivalent I can offer is the sound made by a load-bearing structure when it encounters a weight distribution it has not been tested against and is in the process of recalculating. Both humans stood at the end of the match. Both humans shook hands. Both of them were wearing the evidence of the previous several minutes across their bodies, in ways that my medical assessment tools categorized as warranting attention, and neither of them was paying any attention to those things at all. After the wrestling concluded, there was a pause in the proceedings while the field was reconfigured. During this pause, I did something I rarely do during a professional observation session, which is to stop taking notes and simply think. What I was thinking about was the grin. The human wrestler had been hit with enough force that my instruments had classified it as potentially injurious, had lain on the mat for 2 seconds in a way that looked to my trained eye like a body running a system check, and had then stood up and been grinning. The grin was the part I could not place within any model I had. I have observed many species in competitive and combat situations. I have cataloged their responses to pain, to significant physical impact, to the experience of being overpowered. Most species show some combination of masking the pain, using anger as a response mechanism, or performing indifference. These are the strategies available when something hurts, and you do not want to indicate that it hurts, because indication of hurt is information you do not want your opponent to have. The grin was not any of those strategies. The grin was something else. It was the response of someone who had just had an experience that they found, on balance, acceptable. Not the experience of not being hurt. The experience of being hurt and standing back up. Those were apparently 2 parts of a single experience that the human found worthwhile as a unit. The hurt was not the problem. The hurt plus the standing back up together was the thing he was grinning about. That is a different relationship with pain than anything I have a category for. I wrote a note in my observation file. It said, "Investigate the relationship between human experience of pain and human experience of standing back up from pain. These may not be separate data sets. They may be the same data set described from 2 different angles." When I reviewed that note later, I thought it might be the most important observation I had made in 11 engagements combined. Then came the running. Claire said the word marathon. Long distance. 42 of their kilometers measured along a marked course. A running competition to determine endurance. I relaxed for the first time since the weightlifting had begun. Running I know. The Thraxian sprint is one of the most efficient short-burst acceleration mechanisms in the known biological catalog. It is something I understand in my own body, in a direct physical way rather than as an abstracted data set. Running is something I have real data on, confirmed data, data that has been tested under operational conditions across multiple engagements. The humans started. My instruments tracked their pace from the first moment. I watched the number displayed on my instrument screen. I waited for it to change downward. At 8 minutes, it had not changed. They were running at exactly the same pace as the first minute of the race, with no measurable deviation. At 15 minutes, still the same. At 23 minutes, no change. I looked at Areshtal. He was looking at his instruments with an expression I had not seen on his face in the 11 years I had known him professionally, and I have known him across 2 interstellar engagements and 1 extended siege operation, where the conditions were such that most of the beings involved came away permanently altered in some specific and personal way. The expression he wore now was the expression of someone who has always, in every professional context of their life, been the most certain person in the room, and who is discovering that certainty has a specific kind of floor beneath it. At 31 minutes, a human near the back of the group of runners began to sing. Not loudly, not for the benefit of any audience. To himself, or to the rhythm of his own motion, or to the distance still ahead of him. or perhaps to something else entirely that I could not identify from 40 rows up. A recurring melody that I did not recognize, rhythmic, and even, the kind of thing someone hums when the doing of a thing has become comfortable enough to coexist with other activities. I looked at my instrument readings. I looked at the singing human. I ran the arithmetic that Areshtal was running, that every military observer in that stadium was running simultaneously and separately, and arriving at the same destination by the same route. At full pursuit capacity, a Thraxian soldier reaches metabolic failure at approximately 11 minutes. This is not a deficiency of training, or will, or preparation. It is the biological architecture of the species, the hard ceiling of what Thraxian body chemistry can sustain at maximum output. It is not a number we attempt to improve because it is not a number that improves. It is a number we accept and build our strategic planning around. The humans were at 43 minutes, maintaining the same pace, with one of them singing. The first finisher crossed the line at 58 minutes and raised both arms. His body was doing everything that bodies do when they have been asked to operate past comfort for an extended period of time, all the visible signs of significant sustained effort. He walked to a table at the edge of the field, drank something from a container, sat down for approximately 45 seconds, and then stood and began moving his legs in the deliberate, specific way of someone who intends to keep the function they just used, rather than letting it settle and stiffen. Not carried from the field, not requiring assistance, not collapsed. Standing, moving, maintaining. I sent my first report to High Command that evening. I am a precise instrument, 20 years of assessment training, 11 engagements, a record that has been cited as exemplary in 3 separate compact military publications. I do not file imprecise reports. I do not file reports that communicate personal uncertainty. I do not editorialize. I filed 4 words. We may have erred. The second morning came clear and cold, and the stadium carried the smell of the previous day's activity in its air. That specific combination of chalk and effort, and the biological residue of bodies, pushed past their comfort zones, and Claire found me at the entry gate, before any other member of either delegation had arrived. She handed me coffee. "You did not sleep," she said. I did not ask how she knew. She seemed to know most things about where I would be, and what state I would be in when she found me there, and I had stopped trying to understand the mechanism of it. "I was reviewing the data," I said. "I know," she said. "The numbers from yesterday," I said. "The comparison against known biological benchmarks." She nodded. "They are not what I was prepared for." "I know," she said again. The morning was cold enough that I could see her breath when she spoke. Brief clouds of vapor that appeared and disappeared, each one gone before the next arrived. She drank her coffee with both hands around the cup and seemed entirely comfortable with the cold, which I noted as another small data point in the pattern I had been building since my instruments first flagged an anomaly on the weightlifting numbers. I had been in my quarters for most of the night, running calculations I had avoided running the previous evening, specifically the calculation that connected 2 data sets, what we had observed on the field, and what category of human it belonged to. The humans we had watched were athletes, competitors. The social and occupational classification was clear in the briefing materials. They were not soldiers, not government personnel, not emergency service workers. They were the individuals who, within human society, devoted their lives to physical competition within specific disciplines. They had their own social structures, their own institutions, their own networks of support and development and recognition. They were, by human classification, the people who did this for love, not because they were told to, not because survival required it, because they wanted to. And the things they did because they wanted to had required me to recalibrate my professional assessment model 3 times in one afternoon. "What is today?" I asked Claire. "Today is the main event," she said. She held her cup in both hands and looked at the entrance to the stadium, the oldest one, the one that is probably most us, if you are trying to understand what we are. She said it without the weight of significance, without the performance of revelation. She said it the way you state a fact about yourself that you have known for so long it has become simply true rather than interesting. "Who competes today?" "The best we have," she said. "We brought the best we have." She smiled at the cold morning and the empty stadium entrance. "You will want more coffee," she said. Owen Drake took the center of the field when all delegations had assembled. The stadium had filled beyond the previous day's attendance. Word had moved through the compact administrative apparatus and beyond the original invitation list, and now the seats that the Grethian facility had designed for beings of considerably greater physical mass than the average human held a collection of observers from across the catalog, all of them carrying the particular quality of attention that people carry when they have been told, quietly and with some emphasis, that they should probably be present for this. I had read Drake's file the night before during the hours I was not sleeping. I will not detail the file in this account. I will say that the file described a life that had, at several specific and documented points, found itself in the category of situations that should have resolved differently, and had not, because of the presence of Drake, or people like Drake, and the file documented the resolution and the outcomes, and the subsequent trajectory. And after I read it, I sat for a while, looking at the wall of my quarters, and thinking about what kind of person continues to have a trajectory after the things that file described. Drake stood at the center of the field, and he was not a physically large man, but he occupied space in the specific way of someone who has been in rooms that required him to be the calmest and most certain thing present, and has done this enough times that the calm has stopped being an achievement and has become simply how he stands. He held up the football, brown, oblong, misshapen in a way that seemed considered rather than accidental, as though someone had begun designing a sphere and then made a deliberate decision partway through and followed it to a different conclusion. 2 teams, he said. 1 objective, stop the other side from advancing. He looked around the assembled delegations. We call it football. The translations rippled through the room. The delegations murmured. The delegations settled into the posture of beings preparing for something culturally interesting and reasonably brief. That posture did not survive the first collision. The teams came onto the field in their armor, which was the first thing I registered, and the thing that offered the last moment of professional reassurance before the rest of it began. Species that armor themselves have acknowledged vulnerability. The acknowledgement of vulnerability is data. It tells you something about the species' relationship with damage and what they expect damage to do to them. The armor told me the humans acknowledged vulnerability. What happened next told me something about what they intended to do with that acknowledgement. 2 humans running at each other at a combined velocity my instruments put at 31 kilometers per hour. They did not course correct. They did not attempt to deflect or angle away or reduce the contact surface of the impact. They ran directly at each other, and the collision produced a pressure event that I felt through the seating and through my exoskeleton before the sound of it reached me. Both of them went down. Both of them got up. They walked back to their formations and lined up in the same positions and did it again. I was running numbers. The trained part of my assessment function runs them without waiting to be asked. The numbers were comparing what I was watching against known tolerance thresholds, and finding that the comparison, for the second time in 2 days, was not producing the results the model predicted. At 9 minutes, a human caught the football and was hit from 2 angles simultaneously by 2 opponents who had arrived at precisely the right moment to create a combined impact that my instruments logged as a significant event. He went to the ground from the combined weight and force of both of them together. He lay face down for 2 full seconds. The section of human spectators that had filled roughly a third of the stadium capacity went quiet for exactly those 2 seconds. He pushed himself up with both hands. He stood. He walked to the edge of the field where his team was gathered between plays, and a member of the human medical team moved toward him, and he waved them off. Not with hostility. With the practiced efficiency of someone who has done an internal assessment and reached a conclusion, and is communicating the conclusion clearly, which was that he was continuing, and the only conversation about whether he was continuing had already happened inside his own body and had been settled. His teammates made contact with him, brief touches to the helmet and shoulder, the specific brevity of people who understand that the acknowledgement of difficulty has to be short enough that it does not become the difficulty. He walked back to his position on the field. I watched how he moved, someone managing something, and managing it the way a professional manages an ongoing cost, which is to say efficiently, and without drawing unnecessary attention to the management. Aresh Tal came into the encrypted command channel we shared. They are not soldiers. No, I said. These are their leisure class. Recreational athletes, I confirmed. Competition tier. Separate from the military apparatus entirely. Some of them have other professional occupations. This is what they do in addition to those. Silence. The specific silence of a highly experienced military commander holding a piece of information at arm's length and turning it slowly in the light, looking at what it is before deciding what to do with it. "What?" said Aresh Tal, with the precision of someone selecting each word from a position of significant professional discomfort. "Do the soldiers do?" I knew the answer. The files had told me, obliquely, the way files tell you things when the full statement of the thing is too large for a clean summary. "More," I said. The silence that followed was longer than the first one. The game continued. The display screens above the field showed real-time data alongside each player's name, statistics and histories and records, and the translators assigned to each delegation were working through the context for their respective observers. Beside the name of the player who had been driven to the ground and stood back up, a number appeared. The translator beside Aresh Tal's section explained what it represented. How many times in this particular player's recorded career he had been in situations comparable to what had just occurred. Down. The outcome uncertain. The question of whether he got back up a real question. The answer had been yes every time. I looked at the number. I looked at the player currently in position on the field, engaged in a conversation with his team coordinator about what he had observed in the opposing formation, pointing out something specific about their positioning. Claire was beside me. She had been present for most of the game without my fully registering her location, which tells you something about how completely my attention had been directed at the field. "That one has a broken rib," she said. "Informational. The way you mention the weather, when weather is relevant." I turned to look at her. "He has known for 11 minutes, she said. "He spotted a gap in the opposing formation on the same play that broke it." On the field, the player finished his point about the gap in the formation and went back to his position. There was nothing to say that the observable facts were not already saying. 40 minutes into the game, I stopped running my instruments and simply watched. This is not something I do. I am a professional observer, and my instruments are extensions of my observation capacity, not substitutes for it, and I use them simultaneously, with direct observation in every professional context. I have not stopped running instruments during an observation session in 11 engagements. I stopped running them because the instruments were giving me numbers, and the numbers were creating a distance between what I was seeing and what I was understanding, and what I needed in that moment was to understand. What I was watching was this. Two groups of humans, highly conditioned, highly prepared, organized according to specific roles and responsibilities within a structured system, were engaged in an activity that required them to hit each other, to be hit, to absorb the consequence of being hit, and to continue. The structure was elaborate, and the rules were precise, and the referees were active and attentive, and within that elaborate, precise structure, what was happening was a negotiation conducted in the language of bodies about who would stop first. Not who could hit hardest, not who could hit most, who would stop first. Because both sides could hit, both sides could absorb. The competition was not between capabilities. The capabilities were comparable. The competition was between wills, between the willingness to continue absorbing in pursuit of the objective. Who stops first loses. This is the game. And the humans had been playing this game, in various forms, for the entirety of their recorded existence. They had built institutions around it, social structures, identities. The human I was watching now, the one with the broken rib pointing out the gap in the formation, had been playing this game in some form since he was a child. The game had shaped him. He had been shaped by the specific experience of repeated negotiation in the language of bodies about who would stop first, and the answer that his body had developed for that negotiation over years of repetition was, not me, not me, not today. Not because the pain was not real, not because the rib was not broken, because the objective was still in front of him, and the game was not over, and he was the kind of being that had decided, at a level below conscious decision, that stopping is something that happens when the game is over and not before. I looked at the field full of humans in armor hitting each other, and being hit, and standing back up, and the word that arrived in my mind was not the word I would have used yesterday. Yesterday I would have said, capable. Today the word was, committed. Committed in the specific sense of a being who has made a decision about who they are and what they do when the situation becomes difficult, and the decision has been made so many times, reinforced so often, that it is no longer a decision they make in the moment, but simply who they are. That is a different thing from capability. Capability is something you have. Commitment is something you are. I thought about the unsurvivable zone. I thought about the unrecoverable systems. I thought about 12 soldiers and an open exit. I thought about the word, the short one, the human word for what happened to the Vorkai. I sat in the Grethian stadium with chalk dust in the air and watched the humans play their oldest game, and I understood, for the first time with full clarity, rather than with the clinical distance of professional assessment, that the data I had been collecting for 2 days was not about what the humans were capable of. It was about who they were, and who they were was beings who had decided, as a species, in their culture and their games and their stories and their structures, that stopping is not the default option. Continuing is, and you practice continuing. You practice it the way you practice any skill, regularly, consistently, in structured formats with rules and referees and audiences and records and traditions stretching back further than the written word, so that when the unsurvivable zone appears, you already know what to do. Because you have already done it 1,000 times. On a field with chalk lines and a misshapen brown ball. You already know. The game resolved. One team won. Both teams walked to the center of the field and shook each other's hands. The player from the losing team who had contributed most significantly to the losing outcome walked to the player from the winning team who had contributed most significantly to the winning outcome and gripped his hand and said something that made both of them laugh. One of them had dried blood on his chin. Both of them were laughing. I filed the second report to High Command. 7 words. Do not engage the humans under any circumstances. The diplomatic reception that evening occupied the compact primary function hall, whose shifting color walls moved through their slow spectrum in the background of every conversation, like weather that no one had asked for. The humans moved through the space with the comfortable practicality they brought to everything, which I understood by now as the practical comfort of a species that has been in many different and sometimes considerably more difficult rooms than this one. Vareth Sol, Grand Marshal of the Compact Military Council, oldest active commander in the catalog, 9 wars, 4 distinctions, the siege of Kelthara, where 40% of her forces were gone in 6 hours, found me near the refreshment arrangements and said, in the encrypted command dialect that our ranks shared, "Tell me I am wrong." About what, Grand Marshal? All 12 eyes in their Velhari arc, every one of them running the same number. About the arithmetic I have been doing since the marathon yesterday, she said. Tell me that what I am calculating is not what I am calculating. I could not. She was calculating what I was calculating, what Aresh Tal was calculating, what the Grethian general was calculating, what every military mind in that room was calculating in the private space behind their professional expressions. The arithmetic was simple. The arithmetic was terrible. The humans we had watched were the athletic tier, the competition tier, the tier that does it for love, and the athletic tier had produced numbers that required my comparison model to be rebuilt from different foundational assumptions. What, then, was the tier that did not do it for love? What was the tier that did it because something that they loved was in danger? What did that look like? What did that produce, if you put numbers on it? Vareth Sol and I stood beside the refreshment table and did not say the conclusion of the arithmetic out loud. We were professional enough and diplomatic enough to hold the conclusion between us in the encrypted channel without broadcasting it to the reception. But we both held it, and the holding of it changed the quality of the air between us. Owen Drake was near a window across the room, holding an amber drink and looking at the stars with the look of someone who has traveled far enough that distance itself has become a kind of company. Aresh Tal crossed the room. I watched this happen because I have known Aresh Tal professionally for 11 years, and in those 11 years I have never seen him cross a room toward another person. I have seen rooms cross toward him. He has a specific gravitational quality in professional settings, the quality of something dense and settled, and rooms generally orient toward it. For him to move toward Drake across the reception floor, in the open view of 12 delegations, was a statement that cost him something measurable in the currency of professional identity. He paid it without apparent hesitation. He stood before Drake and asked the question in Drake's own language. Kethanari are among the fastest language learners in the catalog, and in 36 hours Aresh Tal had built enough working competency to ask the one question he needed to ask, without a translation layer between the asking and the answer. Your athletes, he said. The ones we observed over the past 2 days. How do they compare to your soldiers? Drake looked at him. He took a slow drink of the amber liquid. Honestly, he said, yes. Our soldiers are tougher. The reception hall went quiet, in the specific way of a large space, where many conversations stop within the same second. The athletes do it for love of the game, Drake said. He set his glass down on the windowsill beside him. The soldiers do it because someone threatened something they love. He picked his glass back up. He looked at the stars. He did not add anything. He did not need to. The 2 sentences had already done everything that needed to be done. I have been in many rooms where important things were said. I have been present for treaty signings, and for the moments immediately before engagements began, and for the specific conversation that ends a siege, when both parties have run the numbers and reached the same conclusion, and someone has to say it first. I know how a room changes when a thing that matters enters the air. The reception hall changed when Drake said those 2 sentences. Not obviously, not dramatically. The walls continued their color shifts. The refreshments continued to be consumed. The translators continued their work. But something had entered the room's atmosphere that had not been there before, and every being present registered it in whatever way their species registers a shift in the quality of things. And the quality of the room did not return to what it had been before. What Drake had said was simple. Its simplicity was the point. He had not constructed an argument or presented evidence or made a case. He had stated a fact about his species in 2 sentences, and the 2 sentences contained everything that needed to be contained, and there was nothing to add to them, and nothing to argue with about them, and the fact of them sitting in the air was sufficient to change the weight of the room. I thought about the 4 words I had sent to High Command the first night. I thought about the 7 words I had sent the second night. I thought about the report I was still building. I thought about the arithmetic that every military mind in that room was doing, and I thought about where the arithmetic ended, and I thought about the expression on Areshtal's face when he walked across the room toward Drake, which was the expression of someone who has decided that the cost of a thing is less important than the thing, and has made that decision clearly enough that the walking has already begun, before the deciding is fully finished. I thought about the files on the Vorkai. I thought about what the human word was, the short one, the one that replaced 40 years of a civilization's existence in the official record's careful language. I thought about the fact that the official record was careful, that someone had chosen careful language, that the careful language was a choice made by beings who cared about what the careful language was covering, enough to choose it carefully. I thought about the memorial. I thought about 30 years of unresolved argument. I thought about a species that acts, and then cannot stop talking about whether the action was right, for 30 years, in public, with no resolution in sight, because the question will not close. I thought about what that means. I thought about a species that built a memorial to the beings it displaced. Not the beings who died in its defense, the beings on the other side, the ones the official record describes with careful language. They built a memorial for those beings, and 30 years later, they were still arguing about whether everything that had been done was the right thing. I do not have a category in my professional catalog for a species that acts with the capability those files described, and then spends 30 years arguing about whether the action was right, in public, unresolved, ongoing. I created one on the way back to my quarters that evening. The category is called Possessing a Conscience Proportional to the Capability. It is the most reassuring thing in the files, and the most complicated thing in the files, and the thing that I kept returning to, all the way through the night, when I was not sleeping. I want to say something about the quality of Claire's honesty on the observation deck, because it is not a common quality, and I want to represent it accurately. Most species, when asked about their own history, manage the information. This is not deception, this is diplomacy. It is the natural result of beings who understand that how you tell a story about yourself shapes how others relate to you, and who therefore exercise judgment about the telling. This is rational. I do it myself. My reports are accurate, but they are also constructed, shaped toward the conclusion I need them to support. The construction is part of the work. Claire was not constructing anything on the observation deck. She was not managing the information about the Vorkai. She was not shaping my understanding of it toward a particular conclusion. She was telling me what happened, and what followed, and what the humans had done in the aftermath, and she was including the parts that did not reflect well, the 30 years of argument, the question of whether alternatives had been fully explored, the ongoing unresolved nature of the discussion. She included the unresolved part. Most beings, in a diplomatic context, do not include the unresolved part. The unresolved part is the part where you are still not sure you were right. Including that in a diplomatic exchange gives the other party information that could be used against you. It creates the impression of weakness or uncertainty. Claire included it. I thought about why. I thought about it for a long time. The conclusion I reached, which I have included in the longer version of my final report that I filed with the compact historical record, rather than High Command alone, is this. Claire included it because the humans had already had the argument with themselves, at the species level, across 30 years of public discourse, and they were still having it, and the having of it was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of the same thing that drove the rescue workers into the unsurvivable zone, which is that they take seriously the question of what their capabilities are for, not just what they can do, what they should do. A species that asks itself what it should do, over 30 years, in public, without arriving at a closed answer, is a species that is genuinely grappling with the question, rather than performing the grappling. It is a species that has not yet decided. It already has all the answers, which is the specific characteristic that history across every known civilization suggests is associated with the best long-term outcomes. They were not certain they had been right. They were not pretending to be certain. They were continuing to ask. I found this, in the specific silence of the observation deck above the city, with the stars above and the coffee cooling in my hands, the most reassuring thing about the entire 2 days. More than the weightlifting numbers, more than the marathon pace at 43 minutes, more than the broken rib and the identified gap, more than 12 soldiers in an open exit. The most reassuring thing was the 30-year argument with no resolution, because it meant the capability was connected to a conscience, and the conscience was still working, still asking, still not satisfied with its own answers. That is the thing that makes a capable species a good ally rather than simply a powerful one. And standing on the deck above the city, I was very glad the capable species with the working conscience had decided, deliberately and with full information, to stand with us rather than against us. I found the observation deck above the city, an open platform at the top of the compact administrative building where the stars were clear above the city lights, and I stood there, with the night air and the stars and the particular silence of a high place, and Claire found me. She always found me. She stood beside me at the railing and looked at the same stars. We did not speak immediately. We had developed, across 3 days and multiple conversations at the end of difficult observation sessions, a comfortable familiarity with not needing to speak immediately. The Vorkai, I said eventually. She said nothing. The official compact record says territorial misunderstanding resolved through negotiation. That is what records say, she said. What actually happened? She turned and looked at me with the directness of someone who has made a decision to be honest about something that professional settings do not usually require honesty about, and has made the decision clearly enough that the honesty comes without hesitation. They crossed the markers, she said, into a populated area, after 3 formal warnings and a full waiting period between each one. And the response. We made sure they understood the situation would not be repeated. A pause. We stopped the moment the threat ended. We built a memorial. We spent 30 years arguing publicly about what we did, whether alternatives existed, what we should have done differently at each stage. She looked at the city below. The argument is still ongoing. There are academic programs devoted to it. I thought about this. A species that takes an action and then argues about its own action for 30 years in public, unresolved, ongoing institutionalized disagreement about what they did and whether it was right. The memorial, I said. Whose dead is it for? Ours, she said. But also theirs. The quiet after that held the weight of both answers. Your commander said tonight that your soldiers fight because someone threatened something they love, I said. Yes. The Vorkai threatened a populated area. Yes. The gap between those two statements contained the entire explanation, and neither of us felt the need to cross it. I came here to assess your species as a procedural formality, I said. A box to check before integration proceedings. The current Thraxian threat classification of your species is the lowest tier in the assessment system. I know, she said. After 2 days of watching what you call an athletic competition, I said, I am going to file a recommendation to revise that classification to the highest tier permitted. She did not react with satisfaction. She did not react with anything that resembled the response of someone receiving good news. She received it the way someone receives the confirmation of something they already knew, which is quietly and without surprise. Not a threat classification, I said. The tier is correct, but the category is wrong. The word I intend to use is asset, the most significant strategic asset in the compact catalog. She nodded. We wanted you to know, she said. That was the whole point of asking for 3 days before the formal proceedings. The stadium, the competitions, the footage we are going to show tomorrow. We wanted you to know what you were getting before it mattered, so you could plan, so you would not be surprised when it was real. So that when something actually required what you are, I said, the being standing beside you would already understand what that meant. Yes, she said, exactly that. I thought about that for a moment, the deliberateness of it. A species that knows what it is and wants its allies to know what it is, not to intimidate or impress, but to prepare the ground for the kind of trust that only comes from accurate knowledge. I am going to tell High Command to send flowers, I said, and to be very, very polite. Claire laughed. The real laugh. The one from a place that is not managing anything, but just responding to something it finds genuinely funny. The kind of laugh that does not consult anything before it happens. I decided in that moment that the laugh was the most important data point of the last 3 days, because it happened at the end of a conversation about the Vorkai and threat classifications, and what humans do when something they love is threatened, and it happened anyway. Because something had been funny and the body responded, without armor, without performance. A species that can do that, at the end of a conversation like that one, is a species that has made some kind of peace with what it is. And that peace is its own kind of strength. I filed a longer report that night, the full accounting, every data point, every recalibration, every revised number and revised assumption and revised model. The conclusion was 2 sentences. The humans are not a military threat to assess and contain. They are the answer to a question the Compact has been failing to ask itself for 40 years, which is, what happens when a species that cannot be stopped decides to stand with you? And then one final line. I recommend we do not spend a single additional day finding out from the wrong side. The formal military review was the final day, and the chamber was completely full. Not just the military delegations. Everyone in the building who had managed to arrange access. Every administrative representative, every diplomatic staffer, every aide and technical observer who had heard something moving through the compact building over the past 3 days, and wanted to be present when it arrived at its conclusion. Owen Drake came to the center platform alone. He stood without speaking for a moment, in the way of someone who understands that the silence before a thing is part of the thing. We were asked, he said, to demonstrate our combat capacity. Every being in the room. We are going to do something different. The screens came to life. Not weapons, not formation displays, not the inventory of force that every other species presents at a military review, the gleaming argument of numbers and equipment that says, here is the scale of what we can bring. The humans showed footage. The first was from 2031, a geological collapse on a mountain range that had descended into a valley community. The human assessment team had entered the site and produced a classification using their technical documentation's most severe available language, which translated across the Compact's systems as entry inadvisable due to active structural instability presenting unacceptable risk of catastrophic harm to personnel. The footage showed the rescue workers receiving this classification, watching each face as the classification was read, watching each face process it, watching each face arrive at a conclusion. They went in anyway. Every one of them. They worked in the classified zone for 11 hours with their hands and their equipment and whatever they could find, and improvise and repurpose, and they brought people out of the dark and handed them across the line at the edge of the zone and went back in. The chamber held its breath. The second footage was from 2089, a vessel in the outer territories, 42 crew, 800 patients who could not be moved. A cascading systems failure that the onboard engineering team assessed and classified using their documentation's language for, beyond current capacity to repair with available resources and time. The crew spent 11 days making the beyond current capacity classification incorrect. The post-incident report used the phrase improvised solutions 47 times, which is the language technical documentation uses when what actually happened was that 42 people decided the assessment was not the final word and worked through every available approach until one of them worked, and then kept working because there were 800 people on the other side of the impossible, and someone had to find the way through to them. The third footage was 12 minutes from a border engagement in 2156. 12 soldiers, 400 opposition. The exit route behind the 12 was open and available and unobstructed. They did not use it. 19 hours. When their reinforcements arrived and the situation resolved, 7 of the 12 required medical attention. 2 required significant medical attention. All 12 were standing. Drake let the screens go dark. He stood in the silence until the silence had done all of its work. "You have spent 2 days watching us compete," he said, "watching us absorb impacts and stand back up, run past the point where the biology says it should not be sustainable, and then run further. You have been building a model, trying to put numbers on what we are." He looked around the room. "Here is what I want you to have. Not a prepared text. True things about his species in the order they occurred to him. The athletes you watched are not our limit. The footage you just saw is not our limit. I cannot show you our limit because we have not located it. Every time in our history, we have been informed that we have reached it, we have found something past it, and built there instead." He paused. "We are not dangerous because of what we can do to an enemy. We are dangerous because of what we will not do to ourselves. The white space of a pause that knows its own value. We will not stop. We do not accept final assessments. We do not leave the person on the other side of the impossible on the other side if there is a way through. We have been doing this across our entire recorded history, and for a significant time before that, and we are still here. That is the only evidence I can offer you, and I think it is enough." He looked at the room with the steady look of someone who has been in enough situations to know what adequate evidence feels like. "We would very much like to stand beside you," he said, "if you will have us." Vareth Sol stood up. 9 wars. The Siege of Kelthara. 4 distinctions. The oldest active commander in the catalog. She stood, because in Velhari culture you stand for things that have earned it, and she was standing. One by one, across the chamber, every military delegate stood. I was the last. I was last because I needed the moment to be a deliberate choice, and not a current I was being carried by, and I needed to feel the distinction between those two things in my own body before I added my weight to the room's decision. I stood. Drake looked at the room of standing beings from his position at the center of the platform. His expression was not the expression of triumph. It was the expression of the marathon runner at the finish line. Not arrival at something unexpected, confirmation of something that was always going to be true. He nodded once and then was still. When I was a junior observer, fresh out of the Thraxian assessment training program, my first assignment supervisor told me something that I have carried for 20 years without fully understanding it until this moment. She said, "The most important data point you will ever collect is not about capability. It is about direction. Capability tells you what a thing can do. Direction tells you what a thing will do. And the second question is always more important than the first." I thought about that as Vareth Sol stood. I thought about the human footage, about the unsurvivable zone, about the unrecoverable systems, about 12 soldiers and an open exit. None of those situations were about capability. The assessment in each case had already established what was possible within the known capability range. The interesting thing in each situation was not what the humans were capable of. It was the direction they chose when the assessment said the direction they wanted to go was not advisable. They went anyway. Not because they did not understand the assessment. The footage was clear on this. They received the assessment. They processed the assessment. They understood what the assessment was saying. And then they went in the direction they had already decided on, and the assessment turned out to be describing the ceiling of what their model had accounted for, not the ceiling of what was actually possible. That is direction. Consistent, documented, repeated across the full breadth of their recorded history. Direction. When Vareth Sol stood, she was not expressing an opinion about the human's capability. She was expressing recognition of their direction. She was standing for the specific thing Drake had said, which was, we go toward the thing that needs us, and we do not stop until the need is met. And this is not a position we debate or revise based on the difficulty of the path. It is simply the direction we travel. She stood for that. And one by one, the room stood with her. And I was last. And I stood. Because the direction was real and documented, and had been demonstrated in the stadium, and in the footage, and in every file I had read about the Vorkai, and in the way Claire shook my hand at the landing platform, and in the way the marathon runner sang at 40 minutes, and in the way the player with the broken rib pointed out the gap in the formation, and in the way Drake said those two sentences, and then looked at the stars. The direction was real. I stood for it. The last thing Drake did before the review session formally closed was something small, and I want to record it, because small things are often the most accurate. He picked up the glass of water from the platform beside him and drank from it without hurry, and then set it down and looked out at the room of standing beings. He did not say anything for a moment. He did not need to. The room was doing what the moment required, which was simply existing in the weight of the decision that had just been made. Then he said, "We appreciate it." 3 words. Informal. The kind of thing you say to someone who has done something for you. Not a diplomatic formulation. Not a ceremonial expression. The kind of thing you say when you mean it, and you do not need to dress it up. We appreciate it. I thought about those 3 words for a long time. A species that had just had an entire room of military commanders from 12 different civilizations stand up in acknowledgement of what they were, and what they said was, "We appreciate it." Not, "as expected." Not, "this is what you should do." Not any version of the confidence that a species capable of what that footage had shown would have every right to carry. We appreciate it. Because they understood that the standing was a choice. That nothing required it. That the beings in the room had information about what the humans were, and had chosen, with that information, to stand, rather than to remain cautious. They understood the gift of it. And they said thank you. In the informal way of someone who means it. That is the last data point in my professional assessment. Not the weightlifting numbers or the marathon pace or the broken rib or the 12 soldiers in the open exit. The last data point is those 3 words. We appreciate it. Because it said, we understand that being trusted is not the same as being feared, and we know the difference, and we value the first one, and we know that the first one has to be chosen by the party doing the trusting, rather than compelled by the party being trusted. They valued the choice. They said thank you for it. I stood in the chamber after the session ended, and the delegations began to move through the exit corridors, and I thought about the full arc of 2 days, and I thought about what I had understood at each stage of it, and I thought about how the understanding had kept expanding at each stage, each new layer revealing something beneath it that the previous layer had not fully shown. And I thought about the fact that I was still, standing there in the emptying chamber, not sure I had arrived at the bottom of it. That there was probably still something else beneath the last thing I had understood. That this might be a permanent feature of the humans. That you keep going further in and keep finding more. That the catalog, however detailed, however precisely constructed, is always going to be a description of what is visible from outside, and what is visible from outside is always going to be less than what is there. That might be the final thing the files were trying to say. Not, here is what humans are capable of. Not, here is what humans will do. But, here is what you can see from here. There is more. There is always more. Go in and find out. I recommend we find out. I recommend we find out. I wrote the final report that night. The comprehensive assessment that High Command had dispatched me to produce. I detailed 2 days of observed data, every number, every recalibration, every model that had been rebuilt in real time under the pressure of what I was watching. I detailed the footage. I detailed what Drake had said, and the silence that followed it, and what the silence meant, in a room full of the most experienced military commanders the Compact had available. I detailed the arithmetic. The conclusion was 2 sentences. The humans are not a military threat to assess and contain. They are the answer to the question the Compact failed to ask itself for 40 years, which is, what happens when a species that cannot be stopped decides to stand with you? One final line. I recommend we do not spend a single additional day finding out from the wrong side. Claire found me at the docking bay in the early morning. She always found me. I had accepted this as simply one of the characteristics of Claire, and had stopped trying to develop a model for the mechanism. The human vessels were running pre-departure sequences. The ships with their history written into their hulls, their evidence of prior existence, the mismatched panels, and the repairs that had been made and repaired again. The vessels that communicated what they were the way their crew communicated what they were, not through damage but through record. She handed me the last cup of coffee. "Will High Command listen?" she asked. "Yes," I said. I was certain of it. The 4 words started something moving. The 7 words moved it further. The full report will complete the motion. The relationship between our species will change significantly. "Good," she said. The human ships continued their sequences. The sounds of a crew moving through practiced routine. The sounds of a departure that had been made many times before from many different places, and had always arrived where it intended to go. "You said you wanted us to know what we were getting," I said. "Before it mattered." "Yes." "Why?" "Strategically, knowing what you are gives better capacity for planning against you as well as with you." She had thought about this before. I could tell because she answered without needing to construct the answer. "Because we have been on the wrong side of the equation before," she said. "Different times, different situations, people who did not know what we were, meeting us at the worst possible moment. It did not go well for anyone." She looked at the ships. "We would rather build something real. And you cannot build something real with someone who does not know what they are building with." She looked at me. "We are not a simple species to know. We understand that. We come with a significant history, and a significant capability, and a lot of feeling about both of those things. But what you see is what you get." This was not a curated presentation. We brought our best athletes and our oldest sport and our actual unedited footage from our actual history. We are not managing what we show you. This is us. This is us. I thought about that. The weight of a species saying it simply, without performance or management. "I believe you," I said. The word I had been searching for since the landing platform, since the handshake that treated Thraxian chitin like a completely ordinary thing to touch, was the one I had found on the observation deck. Certainty. She carried it. Her whole species carried it. Not arrogance, because arrogance is what you construct when you want others to believe something about you that you are not entirely sure is true. This was the other thing. The thing you carry when you have been tested enough times that the testing itself has become the evidence, and the evidence has moved into your body and lives there, rather than needing to be recalled from arguments. And underneath the certainty, the second word. Love. The thing Drake had described. The thing the soldier fights for. The thing Claire carried in her eyes when she shook my hand at the landing platform without hesitation. The thing the marathon runner had at the 40-minute mark, carrying him forward. The thing the player with the broken rib had when he was identifying the gap in the formation on the same play that created the break. They loved things. Without strategy, without cost-benefit analysis that I could model or predict. They loved things, and the loving made them into something that did not have a discoverable upper limit, because the people who looked for the limit kept finding, on the other side of where they thought it was, more. I believed Claire when she said the compact would be fine. I believed her the way you believe a wall that has caught you. Not because you ran the stress tests, because you felt it hold, and you understand now that holding is what it does. Claire walked with me to the edge of the docking bay. The departure call for her vessel came, and she stopped, and turned, and looked at me with the eyes that had always held more than any individual conversation required. "You will be fine," she said. "Not comfort. Fact. You seem certain," I said. "We are on your side," she said. "That is kind of what we do." She smiled the warm, permanent smile. She left. I stood in the docking bay and watched the human ships lift with the practiced efficiency of vessels that have been through things and have always arrived where they intended to go. And I thought about everything I had observed, and I thought about the laugh at the end of the conversation about the Vorkai, and about the singing at the 40-minute mark of the marathon, and about the broken rib and the identified gap in the formation, and about 12 soldiers in an open exit they did not use for 19 hours because the alternative was something they had already decided was not acceptable. The galaxy had spent 40 years calculating what the humans would do if they were your enemy. Nobody had thought to calculate what they would do if they decided to be something else. They decided. I stood with the last of the cold coffee in my hand, and let that decision settle in me, before I turned and went to send the final report to High Command, which would change a great many things, and all of those things needed to change. The rest, as the humans say, and they have a saying for everything, because they are a species that has been through enough things to have needed words for all of them. The rest is history. I believe them. I believe them about everything now.